Some invitations should never be accepted. This story begins in early 2007. It ends 2 weeks later with a phone call that nobody in that singing group was prepared to receive. And somewhere in the 9 minutes between those 2 points, 9 minutes that stretched into something that felt like a lifetime, something happened in a basement that changed one person forever. This is that story. 8 of them. 8 young people traveling together in a van, city to city, town to town, living out of suitcases and eating at diners and building the kind of bonds that only form when you are far from home with no one else to rely on. A traveling singing group, wholesome by every surface measure. Team members rotated every year. New faces, new dynamics, new personalities crammed into the same shared spaces. By early 2007, this particular group of 8 had already found their rhythm together. They knew each other's habits, each other's quirks, each other's preferred sleeping positions in the van on long drives. That particular evening, they received an invitation to spend the night at the home of a former member, a young man named Drew. Drew himself was not there. His mother was, his sister, his brother. The group knew the family history. Drew's father had passed away roughly 4 years prior. A heart attack, sudden, devastating, the kind that gives absolutely no warning and leaves the people left behind in a state of shock they never quite fully emerge from. But he had not died in the house. That detail was noted, filed away, considered relevant somehow, without anyone being entirely sure why. The drive to the house had been uneventful. Dark roads, quiet music, the low hum of conversation beginning to wind down as exhaustion crept in at the edges. Nothing unusual. Nothing that might have served as a warning of what the night was moving toward. But the moment the front door opened, the moment the group stepped inside, one member of that group stopped. Not physically. The feet kept moving. The body kept going through the motions of entering a home and greeting its occupants. But something internal stopped, went very still, like a small animal that has caught a scent on the wind and cannot yet identify it but already knows, on some level that bypasses conscious thought entirely, that it means danger. The house looked fine, clean, lived in, warm lighting, family photographs on the walls, the smell of something that had been cooked for dinner still lingering pleasantly in the air. Nothing was wrong, and yet, everything felt wrong. The air itself felt different, heavier, like breathing at altitude, except this was not a physical heaviness. It was something else, something that pressed against the chest without touching it, something that made the back of the neck prickle and the eyes want to move quickly from corner to corner without quite knowing what they were looking for. Logic provided an explanation. It always does, when something does not want to be acknowledged. Guilt, perhaps, for the widow, Drew's mother, who had been left so young with 3 children and a life that had been rerouted without her consent. Or perhaps it was simply the awkwardness of staying in the home of someone the group had not always seen eye to eye with, in his absence, hosted by people who barely knew them. That explanation was accepted. Tucked in, settled. It would not stay settled for long. Sleeping arrangements were made. The house could not comfortably accommodate 8 additional people, and so the group was distributed across the available spaces as best as possible. 2 of them were sent to the basement. Now, this matters. This needs to be understood clearly before we go any further, because the word basement carries weight in a story like this, and it would be easy to let imagination dress it up in ways that distort the truth. The basement was not sinister. It had been refinished. Comfortable furniture, clean floors, no exposed pipes dripping in the darkness, no bare concrete walls sweating moisture, no single flickering bulb swinging from a cord. By every measurable standard, it was a perfectly reasonable place to sleep. The cot was positioned about a foot from the wall. Just 1 foot. Close enough that lying on it and facing the wall meant the wall was nearly the first thing the eyes could find. Between the cot and the wall, tucked into that narrow gap like something placed there deliberately, sat a small digital clock. Old. The kind with red numbers that glow softly in the dark. It was noticed before sleep came. Glanced at. Thought nothing of. The lights went out. The basement settled into darkness. The other girl on the team was already quiet across the room. And within a reasonable amount of time, sleep arrived without difficulty. The deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone physically tired from travel, and unaware of what the next few hours were quietly preparing to deliver. For a while, nothing. Just the ordinary silence of a house at night. Just the darkness doing what darkness does when no one is paying attention to it. But here is what nobody tells you about certain kinds of darkness. It is not always passive. Before we reach 2:48 a.m., before the clock becomes the only thing that matters, there is something that needs to be said about that house. Something that was pieced together much later, in quiet conversations, in the aftermath of everything. Drew's father had not died in the house. That much was true. But in the months following his death, in that awful, suspended period where grief transforms a home into something unrecognizable, things had reportedly begun to happen. Small things at first. The kind that get explained away immediately by rational minds determined to stay rational. Doors found open that were left closed. A persistent cold in one particular corner of the living room, regardless of what the thermostat read. The family dog, a golden retriever named Chester, gentle and old and unafraid of anything in his 12 years of life, refusing, absolutely refusing, to go down the basement stairs. Chester would stand at the top of those stairs and stare down into the darkness below and make a sound that the family had never heard from him before. Not barking, not whimpering. Something that had no clean name. Drew's mother had eventually stopped asking him to go down there. And then there was Drew's brother. The brother, older by 3 years, quiet by nature, the kind of young man who listened more than he spoke and always seemed to be carrying a weight that he never quite found the words for, had begun, in the months after his father's death, to change. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have set off alarms in a family already consumed by grief and its particular brand of all-absorbing chaos. He slept less. He spoke less. He would sometimes be found standing in the hallway at odd hours of the night, just standing there, not moving, staring at nothing visible to anyone else. When his mother asked him about it, he would say the same thing every time. "I'm just listening." Nobody pushed him on what exactly he was listening to. They probably should have. The awakening was violent. Not gradual, not the slow, gentle surfacing of a mind easing out of sleep toward consciousness. This was a detonation. Instant. Complete. Like something had reached inside and yanked, hard, from wherever sleep lives, back into a waking state with no warning and no transition. And in the very first fraction of the very first second, frozen. Completely. Entirely. Every muscle locked. Not the pleasant heaviness of a body that hasn't finished waking up. This was something else entirely. This was the body making a unilateral decision, overriding conscious thought, overriding will, overriding every impulse that said move, and simply refusing. The heart was doing something it had never done before. Not racing, slamming. Like something trying to break out from the inside. Like the body knew, at a level beneath language and logic and reason, that something was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The throat closed. Swallowing became impossible. Breathing became an act of conscious will that required full concentration just to maintain. The eyes found the clock. 2:48 a.m. Those red digits, glowing soft and steady in the dark. The only thing in the room that felt completely, reliably real. Everything else, the walls, the floor, the familiar weight of the blanket, all of it felt strangely distant, strangely thin, like the set of a play rather than an actual place. But the clock was real. 2:48 a.m. And then, the awareness arrived. The awareness of something standing directly behind, between the cot and the room, close enough that the air felt displaced, different somehow, the way air feels different when a body is occupying the space it previously did not occupy. There was no sound, no breathing, no footstep, no creak of the floor, no rustle of fabric. Just presence. And the presence was enormous. Not physically, not in the way that a large person standing close to you feels enormous. Enormous in weight, in intention. In the way a thunderstorm feels enormous before the first bolt drops, when the pressure in the air has changed and every animal within a mile has gone completely, perfectly silent. Every instinct, Every ancient, primal, evolutionary alarm system built into the human body over hundreds of thousands of years fired simultaneously. And every single one of them said the same thing. Do not turn around. Not as a suggestion, not as the cautious whisper of mild anxiety, as a command, the kind issued by the deepest, oldest part of the self, the part that does not deal in words or logic, the part that simply knows. Turning around felt in that moment like it would end everything. Not metaphorically. Everything. So the eyes stayed on the clock. 2:48 a.m. Unmoving. Unblinking. And then the images began. Not dreams. The distinction matters enormously here because being wide awake was absolute. The cold air of the basement. The glow of the clock. The sound of the other girl breathing evenly across the room, completely undisturbed, impossibly, cruelly undisturbed. All of it was present and real and fully registered. And yet the images came anyway. Flashes. Violent. Rapid. Like frames from a film being projected directly behind the eyes without consent. Images that had no origin in any personal memory. Images that belonged to no experience, no dream, no dark corner of the imagination. They did not feel like thoughts. They felt like transmissions, as though whatever stood behind was broadcasting, feeding, pushing something dark and shapeless and suffocating through the thin membrane between its world and this one. And then, the laughing. It arrived not through the ears, but inside the skull, behind the eyes, in the place where your own inner voice lives. Except this was not one voice. It sounded like thousands, thousands of things, and the word things is the only word that will ever feel accurate. Laughing. All at once. From every direction simultaneously. As though the basement had dissolved and been replaced by a vast, dark, limitless space filled wall to invisible wall with entities that found something deeply, incomprehensibly amusing. The laughing had texture. It had temperature. It was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air. And under the laughing, threaded through it like a wire, a thought arrived. A thought about not being alive anymore. Let that settle for a moment. Because this is the part of the account that the person telling it is most careful about. Most deliberate. Most insistent upon being understood correctly. That thought was not self-generated. There was no depression, no despair, no history of dark ideation of any kind. The life being lived at that time was, by every honest measure, a good one. Meaningful work. Good people surrounding it. No quiet suffering being managed behind a presentable exterior. The thought arrived the way an object arrives when it is thrown at you. From outside. Directed. Intentional. And the moment it landed, the moment that thought touched the mind it had been aimed at, the fear reached a register that does not have a word in English. Or in any language, probably. The kind of fear that exists at the very bottom of what a human nervous system can process before it simply stops processing. The eyes stayed on the clock. 2:48 a.m. Still, the numbers had not changed. There is a particular quality to moments of absolute extremity, a strange clarity that arrives at the very peak, the very top of overwhelming experience. As though the mind, having reached its absolute limit, goes suddenly and completely calm. Not relief, not peace, just stillness. And in that stillness, at the precise moment when the fear had crested and the laughing was loudest, and the presence behind felt closest and largest and most certain of its purpose, a voice spoke. Not the laughing, not the chorus of thousands. A single voice, separate from the noise, almost quiet. The way authority is sometimes quiet, because it does not need volume to be obeyed. 2 words. Not this one. And then, gone. All of it, simultaneously. The presence, the images, the laughing, the cold that had no temperature, the thought that had not belonged. All of it lifted at once, the way a storm lifts. Clean. Immediate. As though a decision had been made at a level above everything that had just occurred, and that decision was final, and everything that served the other outcome simply ceased. The clock was checked. 2:57 a.m. 9 minutes. 9 minutes. 9 minutes in which what felt like an eternity had been lived. 9 minutes in which the most terrifying experience of an entire human life had unfolded with the patience and deliberateness of something that existed completely outside of time. Sleep did not return that night. The clock was watched. Every digit, every change, every minute that moved the numbers further from 2:48, until the darkness finally began, slowly, reluctantly, to soften at its edges, until morning made it safe to breathe again. The decision was made before full light arrived. Leave. Immediately. Without ceremony, without explanation, without the social niceties that situations like this ordinarily demanded. No shower. No breakfast. Just the gathering of belongings and the walking of legs up the basement stairs and out through the front door and across the driveway to the van, and the sitting down inside it, and the closing of the door, and the first full breath taken since 2:48 a.m. the night before. The rest of the team would emerge when they emerged. The van was the only place that felt, even partially, safe. The morning was quiet. Cold. The kind of pale, early light that makes the world look like a photograph of itself, slightly drained of color, slightly unconvincing. And then the front door of the house opened. Drew's brother came out. He walked across the driveway with no particular urgency, no particular expression. He stopped beside the van. He looked in through the glass. And his face was the face of someone who had witnessed something they could not stop. The face of someone standing at the end of a long chain of events they had watched unfold without the power to intervene. Pale. Hollowed out. The skin beneath his eyes dark in a way that spoke of many nights and not nearly enough sleep. There were tears in his eyes. Not streaming, just sitting there, held at the edge. The tears of someone who has been quietly devastated for a long time and has learned to hold devastation in a manageable place while still functioning. He opened his mouth. "I'm sorry I couldn't help you this morning." And then he turned around and walked back inside and closed the door. That sentence hung in the air of the cold morning for a long time. "I'm sorry I couldn't help you this morning." Not, "I hope you slept well." Not, "Sorry if the basement was uncomfortable." "I'm sorry I couldn't help you." He had known. Whatever had happened in that basement at 2:48 in the morning, whatever had stood over that cot and laughed with 1,000 voices and pushed dark thoughts into a mind that had never asked for them, Drew's brother had known about it, had perhaps known about it for years, had perhaps been living with it in that house every single night, had perhaps been standing in the hallway at odd hours, listening to something that only he could hear, trying to understand what it wanted, trying to manage it, trying, on that particular night, to keep it away from an unsuspecting guest sleeping one floor below, and failing. The look in his eyes, that specific look of hopelessness, was not the look of a person who didn't understand what had happened. It was the look of a person who understood it completely, who had been understanding it, alone and in silence, for a very long time. 2 weeks passed. Life continued the way life continues. The van, the cities, the music, the meals, the slow effort to file what happened in that basement somewhere in the mind where it could be carried without it becoming the only thing. And then the call came. Drew's brother had taken his own life. Just before 3 a.m. Years have passed since that January. The van is long gone. The singing group disbanded, its members scattered into the ordinary architecture of adult lives, careers, families, mortgages, grocery lists. The house where all of this happened still stands somewhere, presumably, its walls still holding whatever its walls hold. And somewhere, in an ordinary home, living an ordinary life, the person who lay on that cot at 2:48 a.m. still dreams about the laughing. Not every night, but enough. There is guilt, too, the particular, relentless variety that specializes in questions without answers. What if a word had been said to him that morning, beside the van, something beyond the frozen silence of shock? What if the hand had reached out? What if, 2 weeks later, one phone call had been made? One message. One small gesture that said, I know something happened. I know you were part of it. I see you. Part of him might have felt less alone with whatever was living in that house alongside him. Or perhaps nothing would have changed. Perhaps whatever had taken root in that family in the 4 years since the father's death had already grown too deep, too wide, too permanently threaded through everything to be loosened by one conversation beside a van on a cold morning. There is no way to know. That is perhaps the cruelest part of all of it. The not knowing. The never knowing. The carrying of a question that has no answer and never will. What was in that house? What stood over that cot? What was the laughing and where did it come from? And what exactly did it want? And why, on that particular night, did it not get it? What did the voice belong to? The one that spoke 2 words and ended everything. Was it protection? Intervention? Some force operating on a level that human language was simply never designed to describe? Or was it something darker still? A predator that had simply found a different target and was merely postponing? Those 2 words. Not this one. Not this one. As though there was a list. As though something with patience that stretched beyond the boundaries of a single night was working its way through that list. Slowly, deliberately, checking names as it went. As though Drew's brother, quiet, hollowed out, standing in hallways at 3 a.m. listening to something no one else could hear, had already been on it for a very long time. And his name, unlike the name of the person on the cot, was not crossed off that night. The clock still exists, probably. Small, old, sitting in that narrow gap between a cot and a wall, in a finished basement in a house that most people would drive past without a second glance. Its red numbers still turn over, 1 minute at a time. Somewhere in the world right now, it is 2:48 a.m. And in some house, in some basement, in some room, in some space that looks perfectly ordinary under the light of day, something is standing very still, looking at someone who is trying very hard not to turn around, making a decision. Not this one. Or this one. Some things that go bump in the night do not bump. They simply stand there, and they wait, and they decide. Stay safe, guys.